Some people look perfectly fine on the outside, but inside, their nervous system is fighting a war that ended years ago. Do you ever find yourself holding your breath when you hear a certain tone of voice? Or maybe you can walk into a room and instantly tell if someone is secretly angry just by the way they set a coffee cup down on the table. You probably think you're just highly observant, or maybe a little too sensitive, but psychology says otherwise. These aren't just quirky personality traits. If you grew up in a household where emotional chaos, icy silence, or unpredictable tension was the daily forecast, your brain didn't just endure it, it literally rewired itself to survive. The childhood trauma doesn't magically evaporate on your 18th birthday. It packs its bags and moves right into your adult life, disguising itself as your personality. But have you ever wondered what really hides behind those survival instincts? Today, we are peeling back the layers on the hidden psychology of adults who grew up in unhappy families. And by the end of this video, you might just realize that the parts of you that feel the most broken are actually your greatest superpowers. Let's unpack this together. Let's start with the most misunderstood trait, people-pleasing. Society tells you that you're just a nice person. You're the one who always says yes to covering a shift, the one who bends over backwards to make sure everyone at the dinner table is perfectly happy, even if your own food is getting cold. But here is the psychological truth. Your people-pleasing is not born out of kindness. It is a trauma response. Psychologists call this the Fawn response, the lesser-known sibling to fight, flight, or freeze. When you grow up in an environment where a parent or caregiver is volatile, demanding, or emotionally unavailable, your nervous system learns a harsh equation. If I keep them happy, I stay safe. You learn to completely abandon your own needs to regulate the unpredictable emotions of the adults around you. But what happens when you spend your entire childhood molding yourself into whatever the person in front of you needs you to be? You survive, yes, but the cost is devastating. You lose your authentic self. You become a human chameleon, constantly shifting colours to blend into the emotional landscape of others, terrified that if you show your true shape, you will be rejected, abandoned, or punished. Living as a chameleon is exhausting. Deep down, it breeds a quiet, heavy resentment, not just toward others, but toward yourself. You look in the mirror and realize you don't even know what you actually like, what you actually want, or who you actually are when no one else is around. The tragedy of the Fawn response isn't just that you serve others, it's that you became a complete stranger to yourself just to survive your own home. Now, let's swing to the complete opposite end of the spectrum from people-pleasing. You might be the strong friend, the one who handles absolutely everything. If your car breaks down, your bank account hits zero, or your heart gets completely broken, you will suffer in absolute silence before you ever pick up the phone to ask for a favour. Society applauds this as self-reliance, but in psychology, we call this counterdependency. It is the direct result of learning early on that relying on others was inherently dangerous. In an unhappy family, your needs were likely ignored, ridiculed, or met with heavy, unspoken conditions. The implicit message was always, "I'll help you, but you'll owe me forever," or simply, "Your needs are an inconvenience." So you made a subconscious, protective vow as a child. I will never need anybody, because needing somebody means I am vulnerable to being hurt, manipulated, or let down. Counterdependency is a trauma response dressed up as a badge of honor. It looks like incredible strength, competence, and resilience on the outside, but internally, it is a profound, echoing loneliness. You build an impenetrable fortress around yourself to keep the pain and disappointment out, but in doing so, you also end up keeping the love and connection out. You are terrified of being a burden to anyone, so you carry the weight of the entire world on shoulders, that are desperately, bone-deep tired. You convince yourself that you don't need a soft place to land, simply because you've never been given one. You survive on the exhausting belief that if you don't do it yourself, it won't get done, and worse, that no one is coming to save you. Imagine it's a beautiful Sunday afternoon. Your bills are paid, your relationship is stable, and the house is perfectly quiet. Most people would feel relaxed, but you feel a creeping sense of panic. Your chest tightens. You start subconsciously looking for a problem. This is the psychological phenomenon known as waiting for the other shoe to drop. When you grow up in an unpredictable environment, peace is not relaxing. Peace is deeply suspicious. To your dysregulated nervous system, silence doesn't mean safety. It means the storm is gathering. To understand this, we have to look at the neurobiology of trauma. Deep within your brain is the amygdala, your body's built-in alarm system. In a healthy family environment, the amygdala activates during a threat and turns off when the danger passes. But if you grew up navigating constant emotional landmines, your amygdala became stuck in chronic overdrive. It was forcefully trained to constantly scan the horizon for the next crisis, the next screaming match, or the next icy withdrawal of affection. Because of this structural change in the brain, when things in your adult life are actually going well, your nervous system panics. It literally does not know how to process safety. Subconsciously, you might even pick a fight, push away a loving partner, or self-sabotage a perfectly good opportunity just to return to the familiar feeling of chaos. As twisted as it sounds to the outside world, to a traumatized brain, predictable chaos feels much safer than unpredictable peace. You are not addicted to drama, and you are not intentionally trying to ruin your own life. You are simply a survivor whose body is desperately trying to regulate itself by returning to the only baseline it has ever known. How many times have you said, "I'm sorry" today? Did you apologize for asking a simple question? Did you apologize when someone else bumped into you, or simply for taking up a little bit of space in a room? In healthy environments, an apology is a bridge used to repair a genuine mistake. But for you, it is a reflex. It is an invisible, verbal shield. To understand why, we have to look at the profound psychological difference between guilt and toxic shame. Guilt is the uncomfortable feeling of, "I did something bad." Toxic shame, however, is the crushing, deeply internalized belief of, "I am bad." When you grow up in a toxic family dynamic, blame is rarely distributed fairly. Parents who cannot regulate their own emotions often project their chaos onto their children. You learned early on that the fastest way to de-escalate a terrifying screaming match, or to avoid a severe punishment, was simply to absorb the blame, even if you did absolutely nothing wrong. You absorbed their dysfunction and internalized it as your own fundamental flaw. You learned to use the words, "I'm sorry," as a preemptive strike, a desperate attempt to diffuse anger before it even starts. As an adult, you walk around carrying this heavy, invisible burden of toxic shame. You feel like your very existence is an inconvenience to the people around you. You apologize for your feelings, your basic human needs, and your boundaries. You constantly try to shrink yourself just to keep the peace. But I need you to hear this and let it sink in. You do not have to apologize for taking up space in this world. The shame you're carrying was never yours to begin with. It was simply handed to you by adults who were too fragile to carry their own. Look at your current relationships. Are you always the caretaker of your friend group? Do you constantly find yourself attracted to partners who need to be saved, fixed, or managed? This isn't a coincidence. This is the heavy legacy of a psychological phenomenon called parentification. In a healthy family, the flow of care goes in one direction, from the parent to the child. But in an unhappy or dysfunctional home, that natural order is completely inverted. When parents are emotionally immature, struggling with addiction, or simply absent, a massive vacuum of responsibility is created. And because children are hardwired to keep their family system from collapsing, you stepped up. You became the mediator during their explosive arguments. You became your mother's therapist or your father's keeper. You were constantly praised for being so mature for your age. But let that sink in for a moment. Mature for your age wasn't a compliment. It was a trauma response. You were robbed of the one thing every human being is entitled to: a childhood. You never got to be messy, careless, or foolish because someone had to be the adult in the room. And terrifyingly, that someone was you. As an adult, you carry this exhausting dynamic into every room you enter. You subconsciously seek out people who need fixing, because being needed is the only way you know how to feel loved. But deep down, there is a profound unacknowledged grief. It is the silent mourning for the little boy or the little girl who had to grow up entirely too fast, who never got to be protected, and who is still secretly waiting for someone to finally take care of them. Let's talk about the complexity of love. When an adult who grew up in an unhappy family finally finds a healthy, loving partner, something very strange happens. Instead of feeling safe and secure, they feel absolutely terrified. This brings us to attachment wounds and the painful paradox of love. As a child, you learned how to give and receive affection based entirely on how your caregivers treated you. If their love was wildly inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes freezing cold, you likely developed an anxious attachment style. You overanalyze simple text messages, and a slight change in your partner's tone of voice sends you spiraling into a deep fear of abandonment. Alternatively, if your caregivers were completely emotionally unavailable, you might have developed an avoidant attachment style. You intuitively build emotional walls so high that absolutely nobody can climb them. You push good people away the exact second they get too close, simply because you would rather pull the trigger on the relationship yourself than wait for them to inevitably let you down. Here is the heartbreaking paradox. You are simultaneously starving for deep connection, yet utterly terrified of it. When someone actually loves you unconditionally, romantic imposter syndrome violently kicks in. You're completely convinced that if they truly knew you, if they saw the messy, broken, and unpolished parts of your soul, they would leave immediately. Because your earliest models of love were conditional, you developed a devastating core belief that you are fundamentally unlovable. You treat love not as a safe harbour, but as a fragile glass house that could shatter at any given moment. But healthy love is not a battlefield. You are allowed to be fully seen, deeply known, and still fiercely loved. Setting a boundary for you doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it feels like committing a major psychological crime. If someone asks you to do something you don't really want to do, and you actually manage to say no, you are immediately swallowed by a massive tidal wave of guilt. Why does protecting your own peace feel so incredibly wrong? To answer this, we have to look closely at a toxic family dynamic known as enmeshment. In healthy families, boundaries are deeply respected and actively encouraged as a vital part of growing up. But in unhappy, dysfunctional homes, boundaries are seen as acts of profound betrayal. If you try to have privacy, an independent thought, or a differing opinion as a child, you are likely punished, ridiculed, or hit with the devastating silent treatment. You are forcefully taught that everyone's emotions are hopelessly tangled together. If a parent was angry, the whole house had to be anxious. Because of this enmeshment, you grew up believing that you are entirely responsible for how other people feel. You repeatedly sacrifice your own mental health just to keep others perfectly comfortable, because the guilt of prioritizing yourself feels literally unbearable. But here is the empowering psychological truth you urgently need to hear today. Setting a boundary and disappointing someone does not mean you did something wrong. The intense guilt you feel when you finally say no is not a red flag telling you to stop. It is simply the growing pain of a new, healthier pattern breaking through years of toxic conditioning. That crushing guilt is actually proof that your boundaries are finally working. You are absolutely allowed to protect your energy and your heart, even if it makes others incredibly uncomfortable. Have you ever experienced a sudden, inexplicable wave of deep exhaustion? Or perhaps you suffer from chronic migraines, unexplained rigid muscle tension in your neck and shoulders, or a stomach that constantly feels tied in heavy knots. You might have spent years visiting different doctors, only to be repeatedly told that all your physical test results are perfectly normal. But what if the hidden source of your persistent physical pain isn't a traditional medical condition, but a deeply buried psychological one? In the world of trauma psychology, there is a groundbreaking concept popularized by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk: the body keeps the score. When you grow up in a family environment heavily saturated with chronic stress, your developing brain does something incredibly profound to protect you. It actively suppresses the worst of the psychological pain. It intentionally fractures your timeline, creating large blank gaps in your childhood memories. We call this complex psychological phenomenon memory fragmentation. You might look back at your early years and suddenly realize you can only remember a few scattered, isolated scenes. Your mind essentially hit the delete button to help you survive. But here is the deepest, most mysteriously tragic truth about human trauma. While your conscious mind is fully capable of forgetting, your nervous system never ever does. Every unspoken fear, every swallowed tear, and every agonizing moment of silent terror was physically absorbed directly into your muscles, your fascia, and your organs. This is known as somatic memory. The heavy emotional weight you carried as a helpless child didn't just magically vanish into thin air, it transformed into physical inflammation. Your chronic fatigue is the lingering exhaustion of a nervous system that has been fighting an invisible war for decades. Your body is not betraying you. It is speaking to you in the only language it knows. It is holding onto the unspoken trauma until you are finally safe enough to process it. If you've made it this far into the video, you might be feeling incredibly heavy right now. It is deeply painful to look at these ingrained patterns, to confront the ghosts of a childhood you could not control, and to finally give a name to the silent battles you have been fighting your entire life. But remember, at the very beginning of this video, I promised to tell you about a hidden superpower. It is finally time we talk about it. Because of the unimaginable things you went through, your brain adapted in ways that make you incredibly special. The exact same hypervigilance that causes your crushing anxiety also makes you profoundly, beautifully empathetic. You possess an emotional radar that most people could only ever dream of having. You can walk into a crowded room and intuitively read the emotional temperature. You naturally notice the quiet person in the corner who feels left out, and you know exactly how to make them feel deeply seen. You are a fiercely safe haven for others simply because you know exactly what it feels like to never have one for yourself. Beyond this hyper-empathy, you possess a level of psychological resilience that was forged in absolute fire. You successfully survived an environment that would have completely broken other people. You learned how to expertly navigate complex emotional warfare before you even knew how to drive a car. But let me be very clear about one thing. We do not glorify trauma here. You do not have to be grateful for the pain that broke you, and you do not have to thank your toxic family for making you strong. You are strong in spite of what happened to you, not because of it. You are the one who actively built that incredible resilience. You are not fundamentally broken. You are just a remarkably tired traveler carrying a massive, heavy piece of invisible luggage from a terrible trip you never even asked to take. But today, right now, you have the power to stop. It is time to finally set the bags down. The trauma you endured as a helpless child was absolutely not your fault, but the beautiful journey of healing as an adult is now your sacred responsibility. If this video helped you understand yourself a little better, and if it made you feel seen for the very first time, you might want to stay. We talk about the quiet, hidden parts of the human heart here. Please consider subscribing to join our community of healing. Let's unpack this heavy luggage together. You are no longer surviving alone. Thank you for watching.